The dark ocean gave no warning of what awaited them. Rocking silently within the confines of an American transport ship, Takeshi Miyamoto kept his eyes fixed on the metal bulkhead opposite his narrow bunk. A former lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Navy, he had prepared himself for many ends. A glorious death in battle, perhaps, or the ritual suicide that many of his comrades had chosen rather than face the shame of capture. But what he couldn't prepare for was the endless uncertainty of what lay beyond the ship's hull. America, the distant enemy land that propaganda had painted as a chaotic, undisciplined nation of mixed races, barely holding itself together while fighting a war it could never win. The ship's engines fell silent, signaling their arrival. Heavy footsteps echoed through the corridors as guards prepared to transfer the prisoners. Takeshi straightened his back, determined to maintain the dignity that had been drilled into him since childhood. Death might await on the shore, he thought. A bullet to the back of the head would be merciful compared to the tortures he'd been told Americans inflicted on their captives. "Stand and prepare to disembark," came the order, translated roughly by a Japanese-American interpreter. The prisoners shuffled forward, some whispering prayers, others maintaining the stony silence that had been their shield during the long journey across the Pacific. As the ship's doors opened, Takeshi squinted against the unexpected brightness. Not the flash of execution rifles, but simply the California sun, hanging lazily in a clear blue sky. The port buzzed with activity. Cranes swung massive crates onto waiting trucks. Workers shouted orders, barely glancing at the line of Japanese prisoners being escorted down the gangplank. What struck Takeshi first was not fear or relief, but bewilderment at the sheer normality of it all. This was a nation at war, yet the port operated with an unhurried efficiency that suggested nothing had changed from peacetime. "Keep moving," barked a guard, though without the viciousness Takeshi had expected. As they were led toward waiting transport vehicles, he caught glimpses of the surrounding city. San Francisco, he would later learn. Buildings stood intact, streets teemed with civilians going about their business, and most shocking of all, advertisements and colorful billboards covered nearly every surface. One billboard in particular caught his eye. A massive painted scene showing elegantly dressed people gathered outside what appeared to be a theater. Bold letters proclaimed, "Now playing, Casablanca, a love story for the ages." Takeshi blinked in confusion. Theaters? Operating during wartime? In Japan, all entertainment venues had been converted to military purposes or closed entirely as the war intensified. The very concept of citizens attending film screenings while their nation fought for survival seemed not just frivolous, but treasonous. As their convoy pulled away from the port, Takeshi found himself unable to look away from the city streets. Women in colorful dresses walked confidently, carrying shopping bags. Children played in parks, and most incomprehensibly, there were cinemas. Their marquees lit even in daylight, announcing films, showtimes, and special features. "Americans still watch movies during war?" he whispered to a fellow prisoner, Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka. "Propaganda films, perhaps," Tanaka replied, though his voice carried the same uncertainty. "To maintain morale." But the advertisements didn't look like propaganda. They promised romance, adventure, comedy, the very indulgences that Japanese civilians had long since surrendered to the war effort. How could a nation fighting across two oceans still afford such frivolity? The question lingered as the trucks carried them inland, away from the baffling normality of San Francisco and toward the unknown of captivity. What they couldn't know then was that those bright marquees represented only the beginning of a profound cultural shock, one that would challenge everything they had been taught about their enemy, and ultimately about the very nature of modern warfare itself. Night had fallen by the time the prisoners arrived at Camp Stoneman, a processing facility where they would await permanent assignment. Exhausted from the journey and still disoriented by the glimpses of American life they had witnessed, they shuffled through registration in near silence. Fingerprints were taken, papers stamped, photographs made. The efficiency was cold but not cruel, another surprise for men who had expected beatings or worse. When they were finally led to their barracks, Takeshi braced himself for squalor, the overcrowded, disease-ridden conditions that Japanese propaganda had promised awaited captured soldiers. Instead, he found rows of simple but clean bunks, each with a mattress, blanket, and even a small pillow. The floor was swept, windows allowed fresh air, and electric lights illuminated the space with steady brightness. "This cannot be real," murmured Corporal Yamada, an infantryman captured on Saipan. "It must be for show. Tomorrow the real treatment begins." Many nodded in agreement. This must be an elaborate deception, perhaps for Red Cross inspectors or propaganda photographs. The Americans couldn't possibly treat prisoners this way, not when Japan's own prisoner facilities were known for their harsh conditions. But morning brought no change in their treatment. Breakfast included eggs, bread, and coffee, more protein than many had seen in months of combat rations. Guards maintained vigilance, but showed no interest in inflicting the humiliations the prisoners had steeled themselves to endure. Most shocking of all was the camp's bulletin board, which listed not only rules and schedules, but recreational activities, including sports, reading time, and, incomprehensibly, movie nights. Movie nights? Takeshi translated the English words again, certain he had made a mistake. For prisoners? A nearby guard, overhearing his confusion, nodded matter-of-factly. "Wednesday and Saturday evenings. The chaplain picks the films." He moved on without elaboration, leaving Takeshi staring at the notice in disbelief. For men raised in a military culture where capture meant dishonor and surrender was worse than death, these small comforts were more disorienting than any cruelty would have been. They had prepared themselves for torture, not movie schedules. They had expected starvation, not eggs for breakfast. The very foundation of their understanding seemed to be crumbling beneath them. As the prisoners were assigned work details, mostly agricultural labor on nearby farms, their confusion only deepened. America was supposedly struggling under the burden of a two-front war, yet everywhere they looked, they saw abundance. Crops grew in fields so vast they disappeared into the horizon. Farm equipment operated with mechanical efficiency that made Japan's largely manual farming methods seem almost medieval by comparison. "In my village," Sergeant Tanaka said quietly during their first work detail, 10 families share one horse for plowing. Here, one farmer has 3 tractors. The Americans treated such abundance as unremarkable. Guards smoked cigarettes casually, sometimes offering them to prisoners who worked diligently. Farmers spoke of harvests in terms of thousands of tons, not the carefully counted bushels that Japanese farmers might expect in a good year. But nothing prepared them for their first encounter with the phenomenon that would come to symbolize the most profound difference between their worlds, the American cinema during wartime. When Wednesday evening arrived, Takeshi and the others watched in silent suspicion as guards announced that interested prisoners could attend a film screening in the camp's recreation hall. Many refused, certain it was some form of psychological manipulation or intelligence gathering. Takeshi, however, his curiosity overcoming caution, joined the small group that followed the guards to a long wooden building at the edge of the compound. Inside, rows of benches faced a white sheet hung against the far wall. A projector sat on a table, operated by a young soldier who threaded film through its mechanisms with practiced ease. "What are they showing us?" Takeshi asked a fellow prisoner. "Training films? Propaganda about Japanese defeats?" Before anyone could speculate further, the lights dimmed and the projector's beam cut through the darkness. What appeared on the makeshift screen was not war footage or political speeches, but the MGM lion roaring silently before giving way to the opening credits of The Wizard of Oz. In that moment, sitting in stunned silence as Technicolor flooded the screen, Takeshi felt the first profound fracture in his understanding of the enemy he had been trained to hate. America was not just fighting a war, it was making musicals. The brilliance of color exploded across the screen like a sensory assault. Takeshi Miyamoto found himself leaning forward, his body tense with disbelief, as Dorothy's sepia Kansas transformed into the vibrant world of Oz. Around him, other Japanese prisoners sat equally transfixed, their disciplined military postures forgotten in the face of this cinematic magic. For men who had come from a Japan where civilian entertainment had been progressively restricted as the war intensified, where theaters had been repurposed for military functions or closed entirely, the experience was overwhelming. The film's technical achievements alone, the seamless transitions between fantasy and reality, the elaborate costumes, the musical numbers performed with seemingly limitless resources, spoke of an industrial capacity that defied comprehension. "How can they spare the materials for such things?" whispered Corporal Yamada, his voice barely audible over the film's soundtrack. "The color chemicals alone could be used for explosives or medicine." But it wasn't just the technical aspects that stunned them. It was the content itself, a story of imagination and wonder, without a single reference to the global conflict that was consuming nations whole. No patriotic messages were embedded in the narrative, no calls to sacrifice or endurance. Instead, they watched a young girl's journey through a magical land, complete with dancing scarecrows and cowardly lions. When the film ended and the lights came up, the prisoners remained seated, as if physically unable to process what they had just witnessed. The guards, seemingly unaware of the profound impact the screening had made, casually announced that they should return to their barracks. "This film," Takeshi finally asked one of the guards as they filed out, struggling to find the right English words, "when was it made?" "Oh, Oz? That's from '39, I think, before the war. Good one, though, right? Next week, they're bringing in something newer, some Abbott and Costello picture." The casual response only deepened the mystery. Not only were Americans attending films during wartime, but they were continuing to produce new entertainment as the conflict raged. The implications were staggering. While Japanese civilians had surrendered every comfort to the war effort, Americans were somehow fighting a global war while simultaneously maintaining a thriving entertainment industry. Back in the barracks, hushed conversations continued late into the night. Some prisoners argued that the film must be part of some elaborate psychological operation, perhaps designed to demoralize them by showcasing American prosperity. Others suggested it was merely a distraction, intended to keep prisoners docile. But Takeshi, lying awake on his bunk, found himself returning to a simpler, more troubling conclusion. What if this wasn't exceptional at all? What if Americans really did continue making and watching films while fighting a war? What would that reveal about the true industrial and economic might of the nation they were fighting against? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Sergeant Tanaka's voice from a nearby bunk. "When I was stationed in Manila," Tanaka said softly, "we were told American soldiers would break under pressure because they were soft, too accustomed to comfort and entertainment to endure hardship. And now?" someone asked. "Now I wonder if perhaps we misunderstood the nature of strength entirely." The conversation faded into silence, but the question lingered in the darkness. In Japan, sacrifice was considered the highest virtue, the willing surrender of comfort, individuality, even life itself for the greater cause. Yet here was a nation that seemed to fight without sacrificing its civilian pleasures, its colors, its music, its dreams. Which approach truly represented strength? The answer seemed suddenly, terrifyingly unclear. The next morning brought a fresh shock. As the prisoners lined up for breakfast, they noticed a bulletin board displaying the local newspaper. There, among reports of battles and production quotas, was an entire section dedicated to entertainment, movie reviews, radio program schedules, and advertisements for upcoming film releases. The war occupied only a portion of the paper's pages, as if it were simply one concern among many, rather than the all-consuming focus of national life. For Takeshi, who had grown up in a Japan where newspapers gradually became nothing but war reports and imperial proclamations, this balanced approach to information seemed almost incomprehensible. How could a nation at war afford to care about film reviews? And what did it say about their confidence in victory that they continued to invest resources in such frivolities? As the prisoners were loaded onto trucks for their daily work detail, Takeshi found himself studying the countryside with new eyes, not just noting the abundance of crops and machinery, but searching for further evidence of this baffling American normality during wartime. What he saw only deepened his confusion. Billboards advertising consumer products lined the highways. Radio antennas rose from farmhouses, carrying music and entertainment to rural families. And most strikingly, as they passed through a small town, a cinema marquee proudly announced a double feature for the weekend, with crowds of civilians already gathering for a matinee showing. America, it seemed, was not just maintaining its entertainment industry during the war, it was expanding it. And the implications of that capacity would soon become impossible for even the most loyal imperial soldier to ignore. 4 weeks into their captivity, the camp commander made an unexpected announcement. As a reward for good behavior and productive work, the prisoners would be taken, under guard, to the nearby town cinema for a special screening. The reasoning, he explained through an interpreter, was partly practical. The camp's projection equipment needed repairs, and partly diplomatic, to demonstrate American compliance with Geneva Convention requirements for prisoner recreation. For the Japanese prisoners, the announcement provoked a storm of conflicting emotions. Some refused immediately, seeing the outing as a propaganda exercise or a humiliation. Others, their curiosity now overcoming their initial resistance, cautiously accepted. "It is reconnaissance," Sergeant Tanaka suggested pragmatically. "We should see how American civilians behave during war. This is valuable intelligence." Takeshi found himself among those who agreed to go, though his reasons were more personal than strategic. The glimpse of The Wizard of Oz had awakened something in him, a hunger not just for entertainment, but for understanding. How could a society that produced such vivid dreams also build the warships and bombers that were crushing Japanese forces across the Pacific? On the appointed evening, 20 prisoners and 10 guards boarded a bus for the short journey into town. The atmosphere was tense, with prisoners uncertain about how they would be received by civilians. Many expected hatred, perhaps even violence, from a population whose sons were dying in the Pacific. "Be respectful and stay with your assigned guard at all times," the commander instructed them before departure. "You are representing your country, even in captivity." The bus pulled into the small town just as dusk was falling. Neon lights glowed against the gathering darkness. Another shock for men from a country where blackout conditions had been standard for years. Stores remained open, their windows brightly lit and displaying goods that had become distant memories in wartime Japan. Leather shoes, coffee, sugar, fabrics of all colors and patterns. But it was the cinema itself that stopped Takeshi in his tracks. The majestic theater stood proudly on the main street, its vertical sign illuminated with hundreds of bulbs, its marquee announcing "For whom the bell tolls" in letters large enough to be seen from blocks away. A line of civilians waited patiently to purchase tickets, dressed not in the utilitarian clothing of a nation at war, but in what appeared to be their finest outfits. Women in dresses with styled hair, men in pressed shirts and polished shoes. "Look at the electricity they waste," whispered Corporal Yamada, his voice caught between contempt and awe. "In Tokyo, using that many lights would be a criminal offense." The guards directed them toward a side entrance, avoiding the main ticket line. As they approached, Takeshi braced himself for the reaction of American civilians. Would there be shouts, spitting, the throwing of stones? Instead, they received only curious glances, a few whispers, and then, most shockingly, what appeared to be smiles from some of the theater staff. An elderly usher actually nodded to them as they entered, as if Japanese prisoners of war were simply another group of patrons. "Why do they not hate us more?" Takeshi found himself asking a young guard named Miller, with whom he had established a cautious rapport during work details. Miller shrugged. "Most folks here have never seen a Japanese person before, prisoner or otherwise. Their boys are fighting your navy, not you personally." The concept seemed alien to Takeshi, whose military training had emphasized that the enemy was a collective entity, not individuals with separate identities. In Japan, all Americans were portrayed as demons, barbaric, cruel, deserving of extinction. Yet here, American civilians seemed capable of distinguishing between enemy soldiers and enemy nations. Inside, the theater defied every expectation. Plush seats stretched in long rows beneath a ceiling painted with stars. Ornate wall sconces cast a warm glow over murals depicting classical scenes. The floor was carpeted, despite the hundreds of shoes that crossed it daily. This wasn't some makeshift facility or propaganda showcase. This was a temple of entertainment that operated regardless of the war, as if civilian pleasure remained a priority even as battles raged across the globe. The prisoners were seated in a roped-off section, with guards positioned at the ends of their rows. Around them, American families, couples, and groups of friends found their seats, their chatter and laughter filling the auditorium with a normalcy that seemed almost obscene against the backdrop of global conflict. As the lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life, Takeshi felt a strange vertigo, as if he were witnessing not just a film, but the collapse of everything he had believed about the nature of the war and the enemy his country faced. The newsreel began, showing American factory production, warship launches, and aerial combat footage. This, at least, made sense, propaganda to boost morale. But what followed defied explanation. After the newsreel came cartoons, bright, hilarious, technically brilliant animations that set the American audience laughing. No war messages, no calls for sacrifice, just pure entertainment created by artists who could have been designing aircraft or drawing military maps, but were instead crafting fantasy worlds for civilian enjoyment. And then the main feature, a sweeping Technicolor epic starring Gary Cooper and Ingrid Bergman, its Spanish Civil War setting serving as a thinly veiled allegory for the current conflict, yet presented with a production value and emotional depth that suggested nothing had been spared in its creation. Takeshi heard a muffled sob from somewhere in their group. Turning, he saw that Private Ishida, a young soldier barely 20 years old, was weeping silently, his eyes fixed on the screen. "What is it?" Takeshi whispered. "My father was a filmmaker in Kyoto," Ishida replied, his voice breaking. "The military took his camera 2 years ago to make training films. He told me cinema was dead until victory. But here it lives while they fight." In that moment, the true weight of what they were witnessing became clear. It wasn't just that Americans had cinemas during wartime. It was that their society possessed such overwhelming resources, such industrial might, that it could simultaneously wage a global war and maintain the full cultural life of peacetime. The implications for Japan's chances of victory were devastating. As the film reached its emotional climax, Takeshi found himself no longer seeing the story on screen, but rather the theater itself, the comfortable seats, the well-dressed patrons, the popcorn being passed between friends, as the real show. This was the performance that revealed America's true power, not its bombs or battleships, but its inexhaustible capacity to remain itself, even in the darkest hours of conflict. When the lights came up and they were escorted back to the bus, the prisoners moved in silence, each lost in private reflections on what they had witnessed. But the questions they carried back to camp would continue to haunt them long after the film's images had faded from memory. "I never understood until now," Sergeant Hideo Nakamura admitted, his weathered face illuminated by the dim lights of the recreation hall. "In Osaka, we haven't had a public film screening since early '43. All projectors were confiscated for military instruction. All film stock redirected to war documentation. 2 months had passed since the trip to the Majestic Theater, and the experience had sparked endless discussions among the prisoners. Each had processed the shock differently, some retreating further into denial, others gradually acknowledging the implications of what they had seen. "My youngest sister wrote to me before I was captured," Captain Shigeru Fujimoto added, his voice barely audible. She said they had melted down the film reels from my father's collection for the chemicals. Even photographs were being discouraged as a waste of resources. These quiet confessions had become evening rituals in the camp, as prisoners gradually abandoned the stoic silence expected of Japanese soldiers and began to share their doubts, their memories, their growing understanding of the gulf between the war as they had imagined it and the reality they now witnessed. The Americans have built 7 new cinemas in California alone since Pearl Harbor, Corporal Yamada reported, having gleaned this information from newspapers available in the camp's small library. They released over 500 new films last year. How is this possible during total war? No one had a satisfying answer. Their military training had prepared them for an enemy that would collapse under pressure, its civilian population breaking once deprived of comforts. Instead, they found themselves facing a nation that seemed to grow stronger through the challenge, its cultural life not diminished but somehow enhanced by the war effort. The camp's movie nights had become increasingly popular, with even the most resistant prisoners gradually joining the screenings. For many, it was their first exposure to Western storytelling traditions, to Hollywood's technical mastery, to narratives that often emphasized individual choice over collective obligation, a concept almost heretical in Imperial Japan. Last week's film, Takeshi noted during one discussion, showed a criminal becoming a hero. In Japan, such a story would be considered immoral, suggesting that one can defy authority and still be honorable. Perhaps that is why they fight differently than we do, Sergeant Tanaka suggested. They believe in personal redemption, not just sacrifice for the emperor. These philosophical discussions might have remained abstract if not for the camp's newest addition, a civilian instructor named Professor Emerson, who had been brought in to teach English classes to interested prisoners. A former anthropologist with knowledge of Japanese culture, Emerson approached his task not as propaganda, but as genuine cultural exchange. During one memorable session, after struggling to explain the concept of leisure in English, Emerson had posed a question that struck at the heart of the prisoner's growing doubts. In America, he said slowly, ensuring everyone could follow, we believe that what we're fighting for is not just territory or power, but our way of life, including the freedom to enjoy music, films, art. What would victory mean for Japanese civilians? What pleasures would peace bring that war has taken away? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Most of the prisoners had never considered the purpose of the war in such terms. They had been taught that struggle and sacrifice were virtues in themselves, that the purpose of victory was national glory and imperial expansion, not the happiness of ordinary citizens. Takeshi found himself thinking of his younger sister, who had once loved to draw but had given up her art materials for the war effort. His mother, who had surrendered her wedding kimono to be turned into parachute silk. His neighborhood in Yokohama, once bright with paper lanterns during festivals, now perpetually darkened for air raids. What pleasures would peace bring? The question implied a fundamentally different understanding of what a nation owed its people. Not just security or glory, but joy. Meanwhile, the evidence of America's different approach continued to accumulate. Camp guards brought magazines showing Hollywood premieres, where stars in glamorous gowns promoted war bonds while celebrating new films. Radio programs played in the guards' quarters featured comedy shows, music, and dramas that continued uninterrupted despite the war, their commercial sponsors advertising products that remained available to civilians. Most staggering of all was the camp commander's announcement that arrangements had been made for a special treat, a screening of a new film that had just been released to theaters. Not an old production from before the war, but a movie created, filmed, and distributed while American troops were dying in Europe and the Pacific. This makes no sense, Corporal Yamada insisted when the announcement was made. Why waste resources on entertainment when factories could be making more bullets? But Private Ishida, the son of the filmmaker, had begun to develop a different perspective. Perhaps it is not waste, he suggested. Perhaps it is strategy. The Americans fight not just with weapons, but with stories. While we surrender everything to the war, they maintain the world they're fighting for. Which soldier fights harder? The one who has forgotten what peace feels like, or the one who is reminded of it every week at the cinema? The insight struck Takeshi with the force of revelation. In Japan, citizens were told that total sacrifice was necessary for victory, that civilian comforts were indulgences that weakened national resolve. Yet here was America, fighting more effectively while surrendering far less. Its citizens continued to attend movies, to listen to music, to wear colorful clothes and eat varied foods, all while their industrial output outpaced Japan's many times over. When the new film, Going My Way, starring Bing Crosby, was screened in the camp, Takeshi watched not just the story unfolding on screen, but the reactions of his fellow prisoners. Men who had once been the emperor's most disciplined warriors now laughed openly at the film's gentle humor, tapped their feet to its musical numbers, and wiped away tears at its emotional moments. Something was changing within them, not just their understanding of the enemy, but their conception of what society could be, even in wartime. And for some, this realization was more shattering than capture itself had been. The changing seasons marked the passing months of captivity, and with them came deeper transformations in the prisoners' understanding of America and its relationship to cinema during wartime. Autumn brought harvest festivals in nearby towns, with films projected onto the sides of barns for community gatherings. Winter saw special Christmas showings of It's a Wonderful Life and Holiday Inn, with camp guards returning from leave describing packed theaters despite snowy conditions. For men from a nation where such pleasures had been systematically eliminated in service to the war effort, each new observation reinforced a troubling question. Had Japan's approach to total war been fundamentally flawed? By stripping civilian life of all joy in the name of sacrifice, had the empire actually undermined its own strength rather than enhancing it? The most dramatic evidence came in February of 1945, when the camp received an official notification from the War Department. The Academy Awards, America's highest honor for cinematic achievement, would proceed as scheduled in March, despite the war entering its most intense phase. The prisoners learned that Hollywood stars would gather in formal attire, that radio broadcasts would carry the ceremony to troops overseas, and that the event would be covered in newspapers and magazines as a matter of national importance. "They celebrate films while their sons die on Iwo Jima," Captain Fujimoto said, his voice caught between disbelief and grudging admiration. "Either they are fools, or they understand something about war that we do not." Takeshi had begun to believe it was the latter. The more he observed American society through the limited window of camp life, the more he recognized that its strength lay not in sacrifice, but in abundance, not in depriving its citizens, but in motivating them through the promise of preserved pleasures and future prosperity. This insight crystallized during a conversation with Professor Emerson, who had continued his English classes, but expanded them to include discussions of American culture and history. In Japan, Takeshi explained haltingly in his improving English, "We were told cinema must stop, so resources go to war. But America makes more films and more weapons at same time. How is this possible?" Emerson considered the question carefully before responding. "America's industrial capacity before the war was already enormous," he explained. "When we converted to war production, we didn't need to sacrifice everything else. Our factories could produce tanks and film reels, bombers and projectors, bullets and camera bulbs." He paused, then added more quietly, "But there's another reason. Our leaders believe that showing what America is fighting for, our way of life, including our arts and entertainment, helps maintain morale. The cinema isn't just escape, it's a reminder of why the sacrifice matters." This concept, that morale might be maintained not through deprivation and propaganda, but through continued access to joy, struck Takeshi as revolutionary. Japan's approach had been precisely the opposite, to convince its people that suffering was virtue, that sacrifice itself was the path to national greatness. Evidence of the differing results was becoming impossible to ignore. Letters from home, heavily censored but still revealing, spoke of increasing hardship, hunger, and despair in Japan's cities. Meanwhile, American newspapers showed a society that, despite rationing and war work, maintained a recognizable civilian life, with cinemas perhaps the most visible symbol of this enduring normality. The contrast became even starker when the camp began receiving new prisoners, men captured in more recent battles who brought fresh accounts of conditions in Japan. Their stories confirmed what many had begun to suspect. The homeland was crumbling under the strain of total war, its resources exhausted, its civilians increasingly unable to remember what they were fighting to preserve. One new arrival, a pilot shot down over the Philippines, described Tokyo's transformation. "The capital is unrecognizable," he told the gathered prisoners. "No lights, no entertainment, no color. Children who have never seen a film or heard music beyond military marches. We fight for an empire, yes, but what remains of the life within it?" In the silence that followed this account, Takeshi found himself returning to the memory of the majestic theater, its bright lights, comfortable seats, and laughing patrons. He thought of the films he had now seen in captivity, each one a window into American life, values, and dreams. And for the first time, he allowed himself to ask the most dangerous question of all. What if Japan was fighting not just a militarily superior enemy, but a fundamentally more sustainable society? The question gained urgency as news filtered into the camp about the war's progression. Japanese defeats in the Philippines, American bombers striking the home islands with increasing frequency, reports of civilian suffering that made the continued operation of American cinemas seem not just surprising, but almost miraculous by comparison. "I joined the Navy because I believed Japan's spirit would overcome America's material advantages," Sergeant Tanaka confessed during one late-night conversation. "But I never understood what those advantages truly meant until I saw a nation that could fight a world war without surrendering its cinemas." This observation, once unthinkable, was now common among the prisoners. The American approach to war, maintaining civilian pleasures while concentrating industrial might on military production, had revealed itself not as weakness, but as sustainable strength. A nation fighting to protect its way of life proved more resilient than one fighting for abstract concepts of honor and empire. For Takeshi, the most powerful moment of this realization came not during a film screening or a discussion, but during a simple exchange with a guard who had returned from weekend leave in San Francisco. "Saw the new Disney picture with my kid brother," the guard mentioned casually while overseeing a work detail. "Theater was packed. Had to wait for the second showing." "New Disney?" Takeshi asked, remembering the animated sequences he had seen in previous films. "Made during war?" "Sure," the guard replied, seemingly puzzled by the question. "They're still making them. This one's called The Three Caballeros, all about South America. Lots of color, music, dancing birds." He laughed. "My brother loved it." The implications were staggering. While Japan had redirected every artist, every chemical, every piece of equipment toward the war effort, America continued to create works of imagination and beauty, not as rare exceptions, but as routine productions. The country was not just fighting, it was living, creating, dreaming, all while its military might expanded rather than contracted. That night, Takeshi wrote in the journal he had been allowed to keep, "We were taught that America's comfort would be its downfall, that a nation of soft civilians could never match the spirit of samurai. But what if comfort is not weakness but strength? What if the ability to make films while fighting wars is not decadence but the ultimate show of power?" The thought, once formed, could not be unthought. And as spring gave way to summer in 1945, as news of firebombing raids on Japanese cities reached the camp, as the war visibly, inevitably tilted toward American victory, the prisoners found themselves contemplating not just defeat, but a fundamental reconsideration of everything they had been taught about strength, sacrifice, and the true nature of modern power. The morning they learned of Hiroshima's destruction dawned like any other in the camp. Breakfast was served, work details assigned, the daily rhythm of captivity proceeding with the mechanical predictability that had become their lives. Then the news came. first as rumor among the guards, then as official announcement, finally confirmed by radio broadcasts that the camp commander allowed the prisoners to hear. A single American bomb had destroyed an entire city. The scale of devastation was incomprehensible, the technology behind it almost mystical in its terrible power. Japan, already on the brink of defeat, now faced a weapon that rendered traditional concepts of resistance meaningless. In the stunned silence that followed the announcement, Takeshi found himself thinking not of the bomb itself, but of what it represented, the culmination of America's industrial and scientific advantages that had allowed it to simultaneously create weapons of unprecedented destruction and maintain movie theaters where civilians watched singing birds and technicolor fantasies. 3 days later, news of Nagasaki's bombing reached them, followed shortly by Emperor Hirohito's radio address announcing Japan's surrender. The war that had consumed their lives, defined their identities, and shaped their understanding of the world was over. Japan had lost not just battles, but the fundamental contest of systems, its ethos of sacrifice and spiritual strength crushed beneath the weight of American material abundance. In the weeks that followed, as the prisoners began to contemplate eventual repatriation to a homeland transformed by defeat, their conversations repeatedly returned to the symbol that had come to represent the most profound difference between the warring nations, the cinema. "When we return to Japan," Private Ishida asked during one such discussion, "will we build theaters before we rebuild factories, or will we continue to believe that entertainment is a luxury we cannot afford?" The question revealed how thoroughly their perspective had shifted. Once, they would have considered civilian entertainment during Reconstruction unthinkable, a frivolous distraction from the serious work of rebuilding the nation. Now, many had come to see it differently, as an essential component of a healthy society, perhaps even a source of strength rather than weakness. This transformation was reflected in a remarkable scene that unfolded in the camp's final days. The commander, recognizing that many prisoners had developed a genuine appreciation for American films, arranged for one last screening before repatriation began. The chosen film was The Best Years of Our Lives, a story about soldiers returning home from war, a subject that resonated deeply with men about to undertake their own journeys back to a changed homeland. As the prisoners filed into the recreation hall for this final screening, something unprecedented occurred. Captain Fujimoto, once the most rigid adherent to military discipline among them, approached the American projectionist and bowed deeply, a gesture of profound respect in Japanese culture. "Thank you," he said in carefully practiced English, "for showing us your dreams." The simple statement captured what many had come to understand. American films had not just been entertainment during their captivity, but windows into a fundamentally different conception of what a society could be, even during war, even under pressure, even facing existential threats. That night, as the flickering images played across the makeshift screen for the last time, Takeshi found himself studying not just the film, but the faces of his fellow prisoners. Men who had once been willing to die rather than surrender now sat transfixed by the story of American veterans struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. The shared humanity of the experience, the universal challenges of returning from war, bridged gulfs of language, culture, and recent enmity. "When I return to Japan," Sergeant Tanaka whispered during a quiet moment in the film, "I will tell my son that our defeat came not because Americans had more courage or better fighters, but because they never forgot what they were fighting for. Their cinemas stayed open so they would remember." In the days that followed, as repatriation procedures began, and the prisoners prepared to return to a homeland many barely recognized from reports, their American experience crystallized into realizations that would travel with them across the Pacific, lessons more profound than military strategy or industrial capacity. They had learned that a truly powerful nation need not demand total sacrifice from its citizens, that maintaining joy, creativity, and cultural life during conflict might be not weakness, but profound strength. They had discovered that the ability to make films while making war was not a contradiction, but a demonstration of inexhaustible resources. And perhaps most importantly, they had glimpsed a society that fought to protect its way of life rather than surrendering that life to the fighting itself. As Takeshi packed his few possessions, including the journal where he had recorded his evolving understanding of America, he found himself dwelling on a conversation he'd had with Professor Emerson during their final English lesson. "What will happen to Japan's cinema after the war?" Takeshi had asked, his thoughts already turning to Reconstruction. Emerson had smiled thoughtfully. "If history is any guide, it will flourish. Art often blooms most brilliantly after conflict. Perhaps Japan will create films that help your people process what has happened and imagine what comes next." The prediction seemed impossible in the face of Japan's devastation. Its cities reduced to rubble, its economy shattered, its very identity called into question by defeat. Yet the seed of possibility had been planted. If America could maintain its cinemas during war, perhaps Japan could rebuild its own as a symbol of renewal and recovery. On the transport ship carrying them back toward the Japanese islands, many prisoners stood at the rails, contemplating the homeland they would soon see again. Conversations that would once have been unthinkable now flowed freely. Discussions of democratic systems, civilian leadership, cultural exchange, and yes, the potential rebirth of Japanese cinema in the post-war world. "My father's cameras might still be somewhere in a military warehouse," Private Ishida mused, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Perhaps they can be reclaimed for their original purpose, not documenting battle, but capturing beauty." Captain Fujimoto, overhearing this, nodded slowly. "The Americans will bring their films to Japan now," he said. "We should learn from them, not just their technology, but their understanding that entertainment is not frivolous, but essential." As the shoreline of Japan finally appeared in the distance, Takeshi felt the weight of everything he carried back to his homeland, not just physical possessions, but transformed perceptions, uncomfortable truths, and unexpected hopes. The lessons of American cinemas during wartime had altered him in ways that transcended the simple fact of military defeat. When they disembarked onto Japanese soil, the contrast with America struck them immediately. The devastation was even worse than they had imagined. Cities reduced to skeletal remains, civilians thin from hunger, the vibrant cultural life they remembered existing now only in memory. There were no bright marquees here, no lines of well-dressed patrons waiting for the latest film, no color except the red sun on occupation flags. Yet as the former prisoners dispersed to find their families and rebuild their lives, they carried with them the vision of what Reconstruction might ultimately achieve. Not just economic recovery or material comfort, but the restoration of joy, creativity, and shared cultural experiences. The path would be long and difficult, but they had seen firsthand what was possible. Takeshi's reunion with his family in Yokohama was bittersweet. His parents had survived, though their home had not. His sister had grown thin, but retained her gentle spirit. As they settled into temporary housing provided by Reconstruction authorities, he found himself telling them not about the hardships of captivity, but about the revelations, especially the continued operation of American cinemas throughout the war. "They never stopped making films," he explained, as his family listened in amazement. "Even while their soldiers died on Iwo Jima, their civilians watched musicals and comedies. And their production only increased. The factories made both bombs and movie cameras." His father, once a shopkeeper with traditional values, shook his head in disbelief. "Such decadence during war! How could this lead to victory?" "That's what we thought too," Takeshi replied carefully. "But I've come to believe it wasn't decadence at all. It was power. The power to fight without surrendering everything that makes peace worthwhile." In the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, many former prisoners found themselves uniquely positioned to bridge the cultural divide. Their experience of American films during captivity had given them insights that proved valuable during Reconstruction, an understanding of Western values, storytelling traditions, and the role of entertainment in maintaining social cohesion. Some, like Private Ishida, eventually found their way into Japan's reborn film industry. Others, including Sergeant Tanaka, became educators, incorporating their wartime realizations into lessons about history, culture, and international relations. Even Captain Fujimoto, once the most traditional among them, wrote influential essays on the importance of preserving artistic expression during national rebuilding. For Takeshi, the journey came full circle in 1952, when he stood outside the newly constructed Yokohama Palace Cinema, a modern theater built with American technical assistance but Japanese aesthetic sensibilities. The marquee announced a double feature: Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon and the American musical An American in Paris. As he watched families and couples line up for tickets, Takeshi remembered that first shocking glimpse of the Majestic Theater 7 years earlier. The lights, the crowds, the inconceivable normality of entertainment during global conflict. Now, as Japan emerged from the shadow of defeat, its own cinemas were returning, not as luxuries, but as essential threads in the fabric of recovered civilian life. A young American serviceman stationed with occupation forces joined the ticket line behind him, glancing at the marquee with interest. "Have you seen the Kurosawa film?" Takeshi asked him in the English he had refined during captivity. "Not yet," the American replied, "but I've heard it's remarkable. Japanese cinema is really creating something special in these post-war years." The simple exchange, cultural equals discussing film as art rather than victor and vanquished discussing terms of surrender, represented everything that had changed since those first bewildering days of captivity. The lesson of American cinemas during wartime had not just been about industrial capacity or material abundance, but about the enduring importance of cultural life even in humanity's darkest hours. As twilight fell and the theater lights came on, illuminating the faces of expectant moviegoers, Takeshi thought of all the former prisoners scattered across Japan, each carrying their own version of the revelation that had transformed them. What would they make of this moment, this resurrection of Japanese cinema from the ashes of defeat? What would they think of a nation rebuilding not just its infrastructure and economy, but its capacity for imagination and shared dreams? The answer seemed to lie in the faces around him, in the quiet anticipation of experiencing something beyond the daily struggle of reconstruction, in the collective surrender to storytelling that transcended the immediate reality of post-war hardship. The lights, the music, the moving images, these were not distractions from Japan's rebirth, but essential components of it, just as America's wartime cinemas had been not weaknesses, but sources of resilience and resolve. As the theater doors opened and the crowd moved forward, Takeshi joined them, carrying not just his ticket, but the weight of understanding that had begun in a prisoner of war camp on the other side of the Pacific. The profound lesson of American cinemas during wartime had come full circle, teaching not just the captives who witnessed it firsthand, but through them, a nation rebuilding itself with a new understanding of what truly constitutes strength in the modern world. Perhaps, he thought as the lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life, this is the most valuable knowledge any prisoner has ever carried home from defeat. That a society's ability to preserve joy amidst sacrifice, to create beauty alongside destruction, to keep its cinemas open even as it wages war, may be not its weakness, but its ultimate, enduring power. In the darkness of the theater, as Japanese and American films prepared to play side by side, Takeshi wondered how many other hidden histories of wartime might reveal such unexpected lessons. Moments when enemies glimpsed each other's humanity through the most ordinary aspects of daily life, changing forever how they understood both themselves and those they had been taught to hate.